Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, January 13th. And our little channel is growing a little bit, which is great. So thank you everybody that's subscribed and follow us. But a lot of people want to know who you are, Dad. Uh, just you being Dad, I don't think is satisfactory for
That was
many
the answer I
people.
was going to give. But okay, well,
So maybe you could we just who are you, Dad, and how do you know
uh,
so much?
international man of mystery.
Hmm.
Um, well, I I'll say I was born in Kampala, Uganda, in 1962, but I grew up in Berkeley, California. And I remember the tail end of the student protests. I was actually in Africa, at the height of the protests. But I remember when we came back, there were riots and all kinds of craziness going on. So I grew up in let's say, just kind of in a revolutionary atmosphere, very intellectual atmosphere. A lot of academics, of course, in Berkeley. And I thought I was going to pursue an academic career. I actually started a PhD program in sociology at UC San Diego. Um, but 2 years into it, I decided it's not something I wanted to do. And I guess there are a number of reasons. One is just that I saw that my career prospects were very grim. It's tough to get a tenured position in academia for anyone, but it was particularly bad at that time. I don't know what's going on now, but if basically there were racial quotas. They didn't call them that, but even your own professors you could see what they're doing. They were only hiring people of color and women, and white men just were not being hired. And that's what most of us were in sociology. So, I just saw this is not going to happen. I'm not going to get a career in, a tenured position anywhere. Um, and then also, I was very disturbed by what I could see as an academic hive mind. There was a certain conception of the world, that you're expected to have if you're in academia, especially in a social science like sociology. And I wasn't comfortable with a lot of it. So I started to look for a way out, and the way out was translation. Um, I was doing, making a few extra bucks on the side because I had to support um, your mother, you and your brother, your little sister hadn't come along yet, on a just TA salary, which really wasn't very much at all. So I made extra money by translating from Chinese into English. Maybe I should mention that it was back in 1986 that I went to Beijing, spent a couple months studying there, and then from there down to Taiwan to continue my Chinese studies. Yeah, I probably should have started here, but anyway, um, that's where I met your mother. We got married. I came back, and then I went and got a degree at UC Berkeley in Chinese. It was actually called the department was called Oriental Languages at the time, but for all intents and purposes, it was Chinese. So anyway, I was making a little money on the side by translating Chinese documents. And all of a sudden, that was the day of the fax machines. The fax machines started spitting out reams of paper, yards and yards of paper. It was this lawsuit that had gotten started up in Los Angeles in the LA area. And there were just, it seemed like an endless number of documents that the lawyers wanted translated. And so I just started translating them. And then I began making real money, and I realized, hey, this could be my career. And so it was bye bye academia. And we went off to rural Tennessee because I realized it didn't matter where I lived. I was just a phone number or eventually just an email address to my clients. And it was much cheaper there, and we could have our own farm. So I lived there for 25 years as a translator. Um, and I could just say one thing about it, being a translator is that you get exposure to all kinds of subject matters. You don't become an expert on anything. It's sort of like being a journalist, but you do get some knowledge of just about everything. So, did a lot of legal documents, and then I also, actually, for a while, was translated for a department of the CIA. I didn't even I didn't have a security clearance, so I had to undergo a background check. And that was quite interesting. I mean, it was back then it was called JPRS, and it was just articles about, all kinds of the things going on in China, political, economic, social, and those were very interesting. I translated a book by a Chinese general about the Korean War. I translated a book about military doctrine. And then I did a lot, in the last 10, 15 years in particular, I did a lot of technical translation. So, and in the end, I just got exposure to all kinds of subject matters, many different areas of knowledge. Um, I
So
think
how
that,
did you become an expert, or I like to think of you as somewhat of an expert on the Ukraine war and Israel-Palestine? I mean, your background, if someone's listening, says, okay, this guy knows a lot about China
uh,
and Oriental going-ons, but what
right.
about Ukraine,
Okay.
Russia,
Yeah.
Israel-Palestine?
Well, in the case of Israel-Palestine, you could say that that was sort of my first well, no, it wouldn't be my first political. It was one area where I kind of woke up to the fact that America was on the wrong side of an issue. And that was way back in like the 1980s. Um, I remember actually just watching TV and, yeah, seeing they hear the Palestinian kids were throwing rocks at soldiers. And I was thinking, it, if if they occupied my land, I'd probably be throwing rocks at soldiers, saying, I wonder what's going on here. Let me look into this more. And I ended up that was way before the internet, but so it just meant actually finding a lot of books, and I just read up, and then I became made myself very familiar with what was happening in Palestine, and then later on, my parents became very active in the as Palestinian advocates, you could say. My father, in fact, was the head of Sabeel North America. Sabeel is a Palestinian Christian organization, that defends Palestinian rights, who puts out the Palestinian point of view, and he was head of the North American division for several years. And then because of that, uh, I I went to Palestine. I spent quite a 2 extraordinary weeks there, visiting, seeing the conditions of Palestinians under the occupation. It was quite an extraordinary experience, and of course, you went on one of those tours as well. So that's my connection to Palestine. So I have an abiding interest in it that went way back, and sort of direct contact with it too. And then as for Russia, well, your sister has been in Russia um, continuously for almost 5 years, and then if you add up, her other stays in Russia, she spent there about 6 years. She's well nigh fluent in Russian. She's on her way to becoming a permanent resident, and your mother and I have visited her twice. Went on long visits, spent time in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and have seen the place for ourselves. And I get almost daily reports from her, so that's a connection with Russia. But it was, I wasn't really focused on Russia. I was maybe more focused on domestic politics and maybe till at that time. But when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out in 2022, it it hit me like a ton of bricks. It scared me because it was like the first war that ever happened in my lifetime where I realized, oh, this is something serious. This is not a TV show. This, is going to have effects on me personally. Um, in the past we've attacked these countries that really couldn't fight back. I'm thinking of the Persian Gulf War and the Iraq War and Afghanistan, and those were just like TV wars for Americans. And I understood that, when it became clear we were involved in it, that this was something different. This was going to have some real impact. And so I I didn't know what was going on because I kind of had taken my eye off the ball, and um, but ever since then, I just really said I got to understand this, and I've been just kind of a Russian Ukraine war junkie ever since.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that was a satisfactory answer.
Okay,
So we'll keep it there. All right. Well, let's just jump into some news then, if you're ready.
sure.
Um, I'm going to start you off with something pretty broad, and that is just about the casualty numbers in Ukraine. Do we know the casualty numbers in Ukraine?
No,
And,
we don't.
well,
um,
why is that? Is that typical during a war that we don't know what the numbers are?
um, well, it's maybe okay. I think at least for one side, I believe like during the Vietnam War, actually in the U.S. wars, we have the U.S. government. I think to its credit, has been very transparent about casualties and the number of killed. I remember that was something like a daily report during the Vietnam War, and as those casualty figures rose, support for the war declined. But the Russians have chosen not to publish their own casualty figures, and the Ukrainians too. Um, the Russians do publish their estimated casualties, killed and seriously wounded of the Ukrainians, and I think they're probably pretty accurate. They, I, there is one outfit. It's the Mediazona project, which I know we've mentioned several times. It's the only one that seems to have a rigorous methodology and for measuring the number of Russian killed in the conflict. And what they do is that they just scour the web and cemeteries, and they for any and find those who are reported as being killed in the war that way. And they've been doing that since pretty much the beginning of the conflict. Um, um, they say, well, they're pretty sure that there's more than that, but they figure maybe it's 20% more. Who knows? It's close to the accurate um, death count for the Russians. And the last I checked, they were somewhere under 100,000, like 80,000 or something killed, which is significant, but it's way less than what like the Ukrainians claim or what most Western outfits claim. Um, and the important thing about that is that you can be absolutely confident because they're using the same methodology throughout. So you can look at trends, right? You can compare the data over time. Um, and if you do that, you see that there were a couple of peaks there initially, like in the first month or two of the war, there were a high number of Russian casualties. I think this because the Russians um, invaded. They entered Ukrainian territory, and I think they probably did underestimate like the Ukrainian strength. And a lot of these convoys, Russian convoys, were ambushed, and there were fairly heavy casualties. Then the second peak is in Bakhmut, which is and that of course was Prigozhin's Wagner group, and it was successful, but the casualties were high. I think the tactics that they used, again, you have to say they were successful, but at a considerable cost to the Russians. And then there was a third, actually much smaller peak in last year, when or maybe no, it was more like the end of 2023, when the attack on Avdiivka began. Some of the initial assaults were again successful, but the Russians paid a fairly heavy price. Nothing as bad as Bakhmut or the first month of the war. But then since then, like the number of casualties, number of killed, as measured, consistently by Mediazona, has been dropping. So now we're down like the lowest that we've seen in the whole war. And this is happening while the Russians are advancing faster than they ever advanced. So that's really quite remarkable. I mean, that's a very encouraging statistic for the Russians, and it should be a very disturbing one for the Ukrainians. Now, we can use that as sort of like a benchmark. Let's say there are 100,000 Russian killed. I think that's probably pretty close. Maybe less than that, maybe possibly a little more, but it should be around there. I think Mediazona is the best figures that we have to go by.
Mm.
Um,
Could you,
now,
Dad?
go ahead.
Could you turn off the AC? Okay, where were we?
Okay, so I was just saying. Okay, yeah. The question is how many Ukrainian casualties there are, right?
Mm.
Now, normally in a war, the offense suffers more heavy casualties than the defense, all things being equal. And it's obvious. You think about it, like, when the Russians are attacking a fortified position, let's say a trench held by the Ukrainians, they have to rush across the field, go out in the open, and the Ukrainians are in their trench, and you can fire from there. So just in general, again, everything else being equal, the defenders have the advantage and are going to suffer fewer casualties than the attackers. And the Russians have been on the offense for, better than a year now, quite clearly. So, you think maybe Russian casualties should be heavier than Ukrainian casualties, but I don't think so. I think it's the opposite. And the reason is that all other things are not equal. We're close to equal. The Russians have a huge advantage in artillery. I think the Ukrainians themselves have admitted that it's something 10 to 1. And the artillery historically has been the number one killer and wounder of troops in war. It's been in past wars, it's been about 80%. And I think we found that it's similar in this war too. So I imagine that drones are starting to eat into that. And with the Russians with a 10 to 1 advantage, are going to inflict many more casualties on the Ukrainians than the other way around. And the other thing is, then the Russians have this air superiority and their guided glide bombs, the FABs. And they started using these roughly a year ago, and have been using them extensively ever since to devastating effect. And now the Russians also have an advantage, a significant advantage in drones, which is a big killer in the war. So in all these areas, they're ahead, and some of them, like, the air superiority is pretty much absolute. They have the FABs, and again, these are 500, 1,000, up to 3,000 kilo bombs that just, completely pulverize fortifications. So being a defender is not so much of an advantage anymore. That advantage has been neutralized by the advantages that the Russians have. So now, instead of having to, just to rush across a field and storm a trench that's, well defended, and, inevitably you're going to suffer many casualties in the process, they can sit back. This is what they do. They pound it with artillery for days. They send a couple of those glide bombs in. They're patrolling the area with their drones, and mapping everything out. And every time a poor Ukrainian soldier goes out in the woods to take a dump, they take him out with a drone. So they get to when they're convinced that the Ukrainians, the forces have been attrited, down to a level where they really can't defend themselves anymore, then they go after them. And now they don't do it. They used to go in these infantry fighting vehicles or tanks. And that's not the way that usually storm a trench or a fortification anymore. They actually get on electric motorbikes, and they don't go in a straight line. They come in from many different directions and, attack at once. And that makes things much more difficult for the Ukrainians. This is what the Ukrainians themselves say. It used to be that you see maybe a column of armored vehicles heading your way, and then you just take out the whole column or half of it, and inflict very serious casualties, because there's maybe in each one of these vehicles there might be 10 soldiers or 8 soldiers or something, and many of them will be killed and wounded. But now you got these 10 guys on motorbikes, and they're all going down different paths. At best you'll take out one, and you probably won't even do that because they're small, fast-moving targets. And so it's through these tactics, but then also this overwhelming advantage in weaponry that the Russians are able to completely eliminate the historic disadvantage to the attacker, and have actually reversed it. And so I think it's just it's the logical conclusion is that the Ukrainians are suffering much heavier casualties than the Russians are. What it is, it's hard to say. It could be something like, I think it was, who was it that recently said 900,000 killed and wounded. Um,
On the Ukrainian side?
on the Ukrainian side, right? I think Putin himself estimated 5 to 1. So if that's the case, we may be looking at 500,000 killed Ukrainians. That would be my guess. Another bit of evidence that we have is actually whenever there's an exchange of dead bodies on the two sides. Well, it used to be something like, I think the average over last year was something like 8 to 1. Like there were 8 Ukrainian dead bodies to every one Russian, but now it's gone up above 10 to 1. Now, so many people have pointed out that may be, at least I think, is partly explained by the fact that the Russians are advancing. So let's say there's a fight, there are dead bodies on the field, the Russians advance, they're more likely to catch the dead bodies, collect the dead bodies. So I think that would explain it, but it still suggests that there is, a definite ratio against the Ukrainians.
Do
So
you
maybe
think
it's not 10 to 1. Probably it's more like 5 to 1. That's again, it's just a guess. Nobody really knows for sure.
right? Do you think we will ever know the exact numbers? Because when I look at historical battles, if I go on Wikipedia or open up a history book, I can see a battle and there'll be very precise numbers that there'll be
Right.
this in this battle, there were 73,422 people to the number, it'll say, and I just feel like in today's day and age, we have a lot more data. It should
Yeah,
be able to be
yeah,
reflected in real time. But the fact that it isn't just leaves it open to complete
yeah. Right,
interpretation.
right,
And I feel
right.
like there's a tendency now that we can't even trust the data. Like, is it going to be
Yeah,
corrupted to fit a narrative?
yeah.
Um,
Right. Well, again, we can, we do have media, so that's something, but um, yeah, and obviously the Ukrainians have taken advantage of this because this is something you find again and again. I mean, when you're reading for example, there may be an article in a major news outlet, let's say the New York Times or Financial Times, um, that does admit that the Ukrainians are in a real fix and that they're retreating. But then always at some point, but of course the Russian casualties are much higher. I mean, this is what they always throw in there. Now there's really no basis for that. It's just what the Ukrainians are saying. So it allows the Ukrainians to if they're not able to completely frame the narrative because the reality is so obviously bad for them on the battlefield, they can still color and spin it, and that's what happens. So people still say, well, yeah, the Ukrainians are doing bad, but the Russians are probably on the point of collapse. Now the thing is, like, if there really was, like, the kind of casualties on the Russian side that we're being told, I think you would see some evidence of that within Russia. You would see like what we see here, in Ukraine. It seems like every other week I see something about a new Ukrainian cemetery, where the newly, with rows and rows and rows of new graves. Um, and you just don't see any. It's not, Russia is not a totalitarian society. People are free to go out and take pictures and post them, and it's just not there. I mean, so there have been casualties. There may be 100,000, which is really quite significant, um, but it's not at the level, where the individual families have suffered, and obviously these tragedies. But it's not something that affects society as a whole. It's still, um, something that's kind of on the edges. I've heard in Ukraine, it's just like everybody knows somebody that's died. I don't know that statistics. It was, it was something like a third during the first year, but now it's well over a half. Well, everybody knows at least somebody closely related, or a friend that's died, and it's gone. And I think, like, this may have been a whole year ago, but it's like the average number of people that they knew that had died was 6. So that's clearly Ukrainian society has been, just has suffered a very severe impact. That's just not true of Russia. I mean, you should be able to find evidence of it if the Ukrainian claims are correct, and you just don't. You just don't find that evidence of those kind of losses within Russian society.
Do you think after this war is over, we will have a proper accounting that the
I think
Ukrainian
we may.
government?
Yeah, I think we may.
Do you think the
Yeah.
U.S. government knows how many Ukrainians have died?
It's hard to say. Again, like I've always said, and I believe that there are honest analysts, within our intelligence agencies. But it seems clear to me that the agencies have been corrupted. It's uh, it's you could say the bootlickers have risen to the top, the ones that have learned that you tell the guy upstairs what he wants to hear, and as so I think we have that you know problem, and then we also there's the fact that we have these very very tight links with Ukrainian intelligence, and I it looks like we simply outsourced a lot of intelligence gathering to them, which means that they just feed us lies. So if lies that are fed into our intelligence agencies and then are passed up to uh, the decision makers.
Yeah, I hope it all comes to light when this is out. It's something that I think is very important, and it's something
Yeah,
that
no,
I
I think it is.
right. I'm just thinking about how history will look back on this. If we take a look at one of these battles, and then we take a look at this war, and we see the casualties, something like 100,000 on Russia's side, and something that could be like 700,000 on the Ukrainian side. It's just going to be hard eh, to wash that stain. Like, how stupid was this war? You look at Russia, just look at the map. It's massive. Plus, you're saying like it's being viewed as the invading country. We can debate on that. We use the referendums or whatever. But if they were moving in to Ukraine, they should have suffered heavier losses, like you say, as an invading country. And then they're backed by NATO, the most powerful fighting force in the whole world, pumping all their money. And then you just look at the end result of this war, what we have. How can we live that down to say and we had to be conscious that we just sacrificed all these people, and we were pressing them to lower the conscription age because they're running out of men. And you just see these casualty numbers when they come out. If it's truly something like 5-1, 8-1, who knows? Hopefully it comes out. What kind of repercussions does that have for the U.S.? Wouldn't our reputation be completely ruined? If you're a country like Taiwan, you'd be like, yeah, they want us to
Yeah.
go to war against China now. I mean, like, what is this? You
Yeah,
know?
right. Well, I mean, um, it should, but we have been involved in disasters in the past. Let's not forget, for example, that the economic sanctions on Iraq caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of children, hundreds of thousands of adults, and directly attributable to the U.S. led sanctions. They were imposed by the United Nations. The problem is like when the United Nations actually passes a resolution, it's just permanent unless all five of the Security Council members vote to revoke it. And so, there were noises afterwards, I believe, from the Russians and Chinese about it. They were as convinced to go along with this. But then when they saw what was happening, they weren't so sure. But the Americans refused to lift the sanctions. And you had, was it Madeleine Albright? She was asked directly about it. You say 500,000 Iraqi children dead. And she says, well, sometimes you have to pay the price. This is a horrible thing. Look, this is, what can you say? But it, it got a little bit of play in the press, but it's just been the narrative goes on, and America is still the most virtuous country in the world, and so I'm afraid that it is a black mark on the U.S., but within the U.S. and within its Western allies, I it really may not have as much effect as we would like it to have.
Right. I just feel like it would have a different impact as this was a European country. That
Hmm.
this is something that
It's
countries
closer
like
to home. That's
right,
true.
Germany and France and the UK, everybody's watching this so closely, and they're being fed this narrative about, Russians fighting the Ukrainians with shovels and throwing them
Yeah.
into, using human wave tactics. And then when it comes out later that it's undeniable, if we see the casualty numbers, that like, what were we doing? What was this? I just feel like it would have to
Yeah, well, let's hope
cause
so.
some
But
repercussions.
again, it's just like the Western propaganda is disturbingly effective, and they are very good at suppressing, inconvenient truths.
Okay, well, you are a professional cynic. You always
No, 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 no. That's Mark Sloboda. I'm just
you're an aspiring cynic. I don't know, you're pretty
aspiring. Yeah,
cynical, Dad.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, speaking about your cynicism, I want to talk a little bit about the developments between Netanyahu and the possibility of going to war with Iran and his relationship with Trump now, because we've talked about this a
Yeah.
lot the past couple of weeks, and you've laid out some very convincing arguments why you think that there's not going to be a change with Trump in both the Ukraine-Russia conflict and with the war with Iran. That's just kind of a green light. Netanyahu's thinks he's got his man in office and he's going to try to lead that attack. But there has been rumors about a rift between Netanyahu and Trump now, and we showed that video before of something that Trump tweeted, a video of Jeffrey Sachs calling Netanyahu a deep, dark son of a bitch. That's a pretty strong statement. And then we also have word that Trump is setting up a meeting with Putin. So have you changed your mind on Trump and these two conflicts?
Um, well, I would say not at all on the Russian conflict, the Ukraine-Russian war. For the reasons that I laid out. I think, Trump really does want to end it, but I think he just can't. I mean, there's just no offer that he can make, a politically viable, from a domestic U.S. perspective offer that he can make that the Russians can accept. I think that just hasn't changed. And then also we've pointed out, for example, that the Russians really, at this point, are unlikely to believe anything that the Americans say. Even if they believe Trump personally, they see what happens. There'll be somebody else in office in 4 years, and quite likely that president will ignore, or very, very possibly. So anyway, we've spoken of the reasons that
Well, just real quick though,
yeah,
doesn't Trump have the option to just walk away? Just say,
yeah,
that's it. No more money. No.
yeah, but we've spoken about that too. That he could do, and I think he should do. But he will pay a cost for it. He'll pay a very high price, and that is that the loss of the war will be pinned on him. It will be unfair. So this is why I'm hoping against hope that the Russians make some really monumental breakthrough before he takes that step. And maybe that will happen, to the point where nobody can ignore it. Oh man, the Russians are they're steamrolling the Ukrainians. It's all over, and nobody can hide it. And if that happens, then it would be easier for him to pull the plug, because he could say, look, they lost it before I did this. But if that doesn't happen, and he pulls the plug, the Ukrainians lose, which is going to happen anyway. But their loss will then be blamed on him. All the blame will be pinned on Trump, and I don't think he can risk that. I don't think he's willing to do that. So I don't think this has changed at all on the Russian side. Now it's interesting. Okay? Go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to try to push back a little bit more. I mean, do you think that Trump cares so much? Like when you say the blame is going to be put on him, the blame by who? Like I think the mainstream media has attacked Trump nonstop for 10 years. It's just been a constant circus of Trump news. So I don't know if Trump really cares about being blamed so much. And I think he could potentially convey the message to the American people and the Western people, because it seems like people in Western Europe and in the U.S. are becoming less and less favorable towards this war. So they might just, and maybe they would be happy with it, and he's able to get that message out. Sure, he'll be attacked viciously by the mainstream media and the deep state, but Trump has kind of built himself as that anti-mainstream media, anti-deep state candidate. So it might just be like, I don't care what these guys say about me. Isn't that possible?
That is possible. But I would just say, on the other hand, if you look at the kind of people that he's appointed, they're all hawks, and and really the way they talk about the war is really no different from the way that Blinken and Biden's men and women talked about the war. I mean, he surrounded himself with the same people. And I think also Trump does not like to be perceived as weak, and that's what they're going to call him. They say, "Oh, he was weak. Biden was tough, and Trump is giving up. He's surrendering to the Russians." And um, but you may be right. It may be that he's now in. He already showed a certain amount of, let's say, imperviousness to mainstream criticism. And I think that probably that trend has continued, and maybe it's reached the point where he can get away with something like that. I hope you're right. It's not impossible. I agree. You just might be right. Again, that's something, like I say, that he's not going to make a deal with the Russians. I don't see how that's going to happen, even if he really tries. But he, like you say, he could walk away. And the question is he will pay some kind of price. He will come under severe attack. Uh, is he willing to do that? Is he willing to risk that? I don't think so, but I'd be glad to be proved wrong.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know, but I'm just a bit more of an optimist. I think it just comes with being youthful.
Yeah,
But well, but yeah, we'll just have to wait and see. I really hope so. I mean, the thing is, often, the argument you make, I think, is very rational, and it would apply well to basically any political candidate. But I think Trump is not fully, he's not
yeah,
a typical
yeah.
political candidate,
That's
so
true.
he could.
That's true. That's the thing. Well, we'll get to we'll discuss this further. Trump's personality when we talk about his
Right. So
relationship with Netanyahu.
right, that's a
Yeah.
good segue. So, Netanyahu and Trump, they seemed like buddy buddy. When Trump won, I saw the Zionist Twitter space, erupt with glee. Like, we got our man. Trump is going to protect Israel and get the job done and show force and strength. And it just seemed like, well, it didn't seem great with Biden. It just felt like if you were a part of the axis of resistance or Palestinians, it's just like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't when it comes to U.S. presidents. But and it seemed like, if anything, that Trump
Maybe
was more
worse.
Zionist.
Right.
But all of a sudden, things have changed. So maybe you can just talk about if you believe things have changed and why they
Uh-huh.
have, between Trump and Netanyahu and everything
Yeah.
in the Middle East.
Okay. Well, there may not be anything to it, but the talk of the rift, I think probably is based on something real. We had, of course, you showed that video clip of Jeffrey Sachs, and you mentioned that, and to my knowledge, Trump still hasn't taken that down, and I think that's got to mean something. You can see Trump putting something up without really even thinking about it completely, or maybe not even watching the whole thing. I think he's a very impulsive kind of guy. But the fact that this has actually now appeared in the news, that the Israelis are definitely talking about it, and he still got it up there. That makes me think. Okay, maybe this was a deliberate insult directed at Netanyahu. And then we also have the fact, Trump's inauguration's upcoming. It's a week from now, a week from today. And Netanyahu will not be attending. Now, they gave as an excuse the ICC warrant. What they said is that, well, let's see, if there's some sort of mechanical failure and the plane was forced to land in a European country, then Netanyahu would be at risk of arrest.
Do you think that's true?
It's possible. You can't say that but it just seems highly unlikely.
The Americans would not allow it,
Yeah,
if it
that's the
landed in a
thing.
European country.
That's the thing. It's like, even if it did happen, I think it was like the Americans would just make it extra clear. You're not going to board that plane. And he's on the way to, and just knowing the Europeans, they just wouldn't risk it. I don't think so. I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true. I think and people have pointed out that in general, heads of state, from foreign countries don't attend inaugurations. But again, Israel is different, and Netanyahu is different. And this was a chance for him to celebrate, the coming of his new ally, and maybe also to lay the groundwork for an upcoming attack. So there may really be a rift. Now, okay, let's first of all set out like the facts that Trump is a Zionist, and he's been very closely allied with Netanyahu. I mean, in his first term, he moved approved, um, the moving of the embassy, the American embassy to Jerusalem. He recognized the annexation of the Golan Heights. He pushed through or nearly succeeded in pushing through the Abraham Accords, which would have normalized relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and also, I believe, UAE. Um, those
Those-
were major breakthroughs, major gifts to Israel that previous presidents had not, given.
And also,
So,
just to add to it, the tearing up of the JCOP for
yeah,
and also the
it's
assassination of Soleimani,
yeah, JCPOA, yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
JCPOA, right.
yeah, right, and yeah, right, and the fact that yeah, he also has shared the Israeli hatred of Iran. Yeah, he seems to legitimately hate the Iranian government for some reason, um, in a way that he doesn't seem to hate any other government in the world. He's willing to, talk to Kim Jong Un and so on and so forth. But and then let's not forget that during the campaign he set himself as like a Zionist. He presented himself as a Zionist and continually attacked the Democrats. Here's Biden and it's just done bent over backwards and given the Israelis everything. I think it was 22 billion and now another 8 billion on top of that in military aid, and then been completely complicit in the genocide. But he's basically like a Hamas supporter or
Yeah, he
something.
called him a
Yeah,
Palestinian.
yeah,
You
right.
know,
So,
it's
it's, yeah, let's not forget any of that. And then the fact that the number one donor, okay, to the Trump campaign was the Adelson family, Miriam Adelson. And I think it's $100 million. So, they gave him that money because they feel like he's going to do work for them.
and
He's going to carry out, and the next big thing, he's already moved the embassy. He's already recognized, the Golan Heights. I think they're looking for recognition of the West Bank and an attack on Iran. And I think that's, probably what I wouldn't be surprised if he promised those things. So let's not forget any of that. But, but there's, one thing is that Trump is different from other politicians, like you were saying. Um, I would say like every other Western leader and every, American president, well, let's say ever since maybe Ronald Reagan, um, has been basically an empty suit. I would say just a creature of the establishment, somebody with a very weak personality. Well, I wouldn't say Clinton has a weak personality, but he was fundamentally part of the establishment. Okay, and I'm not saying that the ones before were anti-establishment, but they did, I think they had stronger personalities. Let's just put it that way, and they could occasionally just say no and go their own way. Now, people like Biden, Keir Starmer, Olaf Scholz, these people just can't say no. They're just establishment creatures. That's why they rose to the top. Macron's a little different. He talks occasionally, kind of like goes, kind of wanders off the plantation with his musings about different things. But when it comes to action, he's always a creature of the establishment. He never goes against the establishment. And that's just true of every Western leader. It just is, with the exception, of course, of the dissidents, Fico and Orban. Occasionally maybe we see it in Meloni. We do see some signs of dissidents, but the leaders of all the major countries have very weak personalities, and they just never surprise us. They always do what the establishment wants. Occasionally, it's against their own better instincts. They think, maybe this doesn't really make sense, but they're telling me to do this. I got to do this. And we know that Biden really actually hated Netanyahu, but he always, just he kept his grumblings and his cursing, private, and always went along with the Israelis. And that's been true of previous presidents of Obama and Bush too. I think actually everybody's had differences, real serious differences, or really private differences with Netanyahu. He is universally disliked. There was a hot mic incident. I think it was Sarkozy and Obama, where they're talking about Netanyahu. I just can't stand the guy. He got out, but both of them always did his bit. Publicly they were just always couldn't meet his demands fast enough. Now Trump, I think, is a different creature. He doesn't have that weak personality. He has a strong personality. He's uh, he's going to be chaotic and yeah, and kind of unpredictable too. So it was something that I know I mentioned in an earlier program. It's just that, yeah. I mean, he's shown himself to be very closely allied with Netanyahu in all his policies. But when Netanyahu backstabs him, he might not take it the way that previous American presidents have taken it. They just accept it. Yeah, he might be the sort of person who just says that, that's SOB. I'm gonna show him, and maybe that's what happened. I wouldn't be surprised if Netanyahu hasn't already done something to anger him. Broken a promise, and he's mad. But let's also keep in mind that he's got all these commitments to Israel and against Iran, and those haven't gone away. So I think there may be a rift, but whether this actually has real policy consequences, that's a separate issue. And I think probably it won't, almost certainly it won't. It may be temporary, that may, but there are all those his own motivations, his own, and those of, the promises that he's made to people like the Adelsons and the kind of people that he's put around. He's put extreme Iran warhawks around him. So I'm afraid that we're still going to see an attack on Iran. But with Trump, it was like, again with these other leaders, there's just no chance that he'll say no in a big way. Other leaders will say no, but Trump just, I have to admit, he just might. He is a kind of as Mark Sloboda says, a chaos agent. And so there is always a chance, where I don't think there was ever a chance. I think Biden eventually was going to go along with whatever Netanyahu decided to do. And the same would have been true of Kamala Harris. But Trump just might say, hey, to hell with you. I'm not doing this anymore.
Right. Yeah, I think Trump was also a bit slighted by Netanyahu when the previous election, when Biden beat Trump. Netanyahu was pretty quick to congratulate Biden on his victory, and Trump was still trying to say that he was president. So I think that hurt him. He felt maybe a little bit betrayed by that.
Yeah.
Also, Alexander Mercouris, I was listening to him last night, had a sort of interesting theory is that Netanyahu approached Trump and his team first about the idea to carry out an attack on Iran because Netanyahu feels like this is the time now that Syria is in chaos. There is, we destroyed the air defenses and now's the time to strike before this comprehensive defense compact between Russia and Iran is signed. This is the time to do it. This is our window of opportunity. It sounded like Trump wasn't keen on it. And then we find out through this Axios article just a couple weeks ago that that Jake Sullivan was pitching the attack plan to Biden to carry out this attack on Iran. And luckily, Biden said no. We still have a week. Let's see if anything happens. But that angered Trump greatly. He said, I told you no, and then you try to use your tools to push this strike with the current president because he still has a couple of weeks left. Try to have him do it and then leave a hot steaming mess for me. And that just, I think, may have angered him greatly. Do you think that's an accurate potential accounting what happened?
Yeah, it's I guess he would admit that it's speculation, but I think it's reasonable speculation. It just may be true. And yeah, I guess the great question about Trump is like what is motivating him? Is it just kind of like personal animus? He's just like this damn backstabber, or is it actually policy? I mean, is it that he does not want a war? I hope it's the latter. I'm just not confident that it is. We'll see. Yeah, he may be right. But but again, I would point to all those forces that already exist and that, that surround him. That, and I think Alexander Mercouris would agree that it's still an open question, whether or not he'll be able to withstand those forces in the medium or long term. So, right now he wants Netanyahu to stew in his own juices for a little bit, learn his lesson, be more respectful to me. But he may, they may join forces in the not so different, distant future.
Maybe I was just thinking, I was saying that Jake Sullivan was the one really, from my understanding, was the one that was pushing Biden to do this attack on Iran. They're discussing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me wonder if people like Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, would it be correct to characterize them as really servants of the Israeli government more so than the U.S. government? I mean, from my understanding, it was like that that they were this attack plan was being pushed, but it was really coming from the Israelis.
Yeah.
So did the Israelis phone up Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken? And then
I'm
Anthony
afraid it's
Blinken.
true. Again, yeah. I mean, again, we've talked about like the Iraq War and the research that Mearsheimer did, and that's what the conclusion that he reached. He and Stephen Waltz. Yeah, because you stop and think about it. Like, what's in it for the Americans? Iran does not present any kind of threat to the United States. Let's just be honest about that. We had a difference with them, way back in the late 70s, and that's, it's a long, long time ago, and we've paid them back many times over. The decades that followed. We have absolutely no reason to attack Iran, and in fact, we have very powerful reasons not to. And I think that those have been. The Pentagon and the intelligence agencies have pointed that out again and again. It is Israel. Israel drives this, this anti-Iran, this campaign. They've constantly been applying pressure, and they got all kinds of people, within the U.S. government that. That pretty much do their bidding, have ceased to distinguish between American interests and Israeli interests, unfortunately. They've adopted Zionism, and they've just kind of made it part of their own, mental makeup. So that's what's happening. I mean, again, it's not in the American interest. It just is not in the American interest to attack Iran.
Yeah, it's really wild. I mean, Anthony Blinken, when he went to Israel after October 7th, I think the first thing he said is, "I come to you as a Jew." It's like, you're the Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Right.
You are supposed to be representing Americans. It's like, it's so clear that that he's not working for the United States. It's like, or he's not working for the American people. He's got a different agenda. And it's amazing to me how our government just became completely populated with people that don't give a damn about people living in America.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. And I think this could be a good segue just to kind of talk about the California wildfires, just all these natural disasters that have happened in the United States. And we find out the fire hydrants don't have enough water. There were budget cuts to the fire department. My wife, her friend, lost her home in the Maui fires, that happened. And FEMA gave out $750. That's it for losing her home and her cars, everything, the whole family, everything wiped out. And then just we're here in Appalachia. We had the flooding, just homes destroyed, just an hour away from us. Just neighborhoods completely devastated. And it seems like we don't have the budget to help the people that are suffering here, that are losing their homes. But whenever there is a check to write to Ukraine or Israel, there's no hesitation. And you can understand the frustration that the American people have when they see these problems at home where they can't even protect themselves from natural disasters. The government doesn't seem to have the budget. And a lot of times people come and say, well, you shouldn't look at it like that. Things are earmarked for certain things and they can't move. And, you don't understand how the system works. The money's actually coming back in and it's helping all of us. Is there any truth to that? I mean, do we all have a right to be outraged because when I see these numbers of when I watch like local news, it's like, oh, we've raised $500,000 the community to help, the homeless issue or to help people in need. And people are coming together in their own personal communities, sacrificing their own money to try to support the problems addressing their own communities, as well as paying tons of taxes to the federal government, and we're still $36 trillion in debt. And where's this
Yeah.
money going? When you look
Yeah.
at the numbers, it's
Right.
just like, oh, the budget was cut by 17 million for a whole state of California. It's like 17 million is nothing when you look at 113 billion aid package that was just passed in June. Like, make it make sense.
Well, it really doesn't make sense. Yeah, there is real pushback on that. And I think that's something that everybody understands. Um, so the polls show, and you can just see it on the, in social media. There's a lot of anger. People do make the comparisons. They look at that money that's going overseas. And, a lot of them don't have much of an understanding of what's happening in Ukraine or in Palestine. But they do understand that a government should be taking care of its own first. And when they see that happening, they get angry. Um, and the Republicans, I think, in general, have tapped into that real and I think justified anger. So that's something that, again, Trump can work with. Hopefully, if he's very, uh, if he deals with this skillfully, I think he would play up these things and say, look, Ukraine is not our problem, and whatever. The Democrats have wasted, 200 billion dollars on Ukraine. Look what's happening to our own country. And the fact is they failed. The Ukrainians are losing and are going to lose. He could make, I hope you're right, and he goes up and he takes on the establishment. He's not afraid of, the criticisms that will come. They'll call him a loser and afraid and a Putin stooge. And maybe he can pull it off because there is that's something that people understand. I think the vast majority of people don't really know what Ukraine is and couldn't tell you, couldn't find it on a map. And, just like they couldn't explain the difference between a Shia and Sunni in the Middle East. And apparently George W. Bush didn't even know the difference, before he launched his invasion. It's crazy. They couldn't tell you, had no idea that there are, Russians within Ukraine and or any of this, right? But they don't need to know it. They just know it's wrong to be sending that money there. And I think that is something, that's one card that Trump has to play, and hopefully he'll play it.
Okay. Well, are you a little bit more positive for 2025, or do we just have a lot more chaos and death and destruction in
I
our
think
future?
probably, um, I'm expecting a lot more chaos, death, and destruction, unfortunately. I guess I would have to say, and actually Jeffrey Sachs himself said this. Jeffrey Sachs is no fan of Trump. I'm not a fan of Trump either. But he said that with Biden, there was no hope. It was clear that he was always going to give the Israelis what they wanted. But he said with Trump, he said probably we're going to be disappointed and we're going to get more of the same. And I think he's right. I mean, that's been the history. The deep state wins out in these kind of contests. But he says there's at least hope with Trump. And I'll admit that. So there is some hope.
I think one of the things that gives me hope now is that the deep state, it's real. If I talked about it, I never think it was a real thing. Growing up, you had faith in all these institutions.
Yeah.
And now
right.
to me, it's just so apparent that the deep state, it's a
well,
real
that's
thing.
Yeah, no, it's quite extraordinary. I remember when I was young, when you talked about the deep state, you were talking about Turkey. I mean, seriously, that's where that term deep state was associated with Turkey. Because I remember that Turkey went through kind of, it seemed like every few years there was a coup or, some new leader was installed. But they said nothing really changed because it's the deep state. It was really based within the Turkish military, really controlled things. Mm-hmm. And the president was just a figurehead. And nobody, only a few wacko conspiracy theorists would say that about the U.S. until Trump came along. Really, I think Trump did it more than anybody else, just because he kind of he provoked such, this Trump derangement syndrome that his opponents just went to such extremes that they they kind of lost their sense of caution and just came out in the open, and everybody saw it. They saw the Russia hoax and all kinds of things. And so now, yeah, everybody talks about the deep state. It's just a known fact.
Right. And so the fact that it's now a known fact that there's just unelected bureaucrats that are kind of running the government and they have their own globalist agenda.
Right.
It's
And
just,
then we saw, then we had Dementia Joe in charge. Clearly this guy was not capable of running anything. He probably wouldn't be able to run the recreation room in an old folks home. But he was supposed to be the president of the U.S., but still, somebody clearly was running it. It wasn't him. So, I mean, it's just like everybody said, well, clearly the deep state's in charge. Just relax.
Yeah. No, it's so unbelievable. It's
Yeah.
that I think we've come acclimated to it. Just how insane the past.
No, it's right. Yeah. That's right. Just go back 10 years. Well, certainly before 2016. It's just that, yeah, we have seen a real revolution in perception, let's say.
U.S. perception. It's just the cat's out of the bag. So it's just to me that it's unsustainable. The current government, it's exposed. Everybody's like, democracy is becoming a joke now. The idea of a democracy and across all of Western Europe. So it's just the whole thing is crumbling down. I feel.
I just have to see. I saw this story. It was the former EC commissioner. I think it was Thierry Bertrand, I think was his name. But he said, he basically threatened the Germans, don't you dare elect the AfD. Well, if you do that, you saw what we did in Romania. This is what he said openly. We'll do it to you. In other words, we'll ban you, annul your election. And it's just, okay, yeah.
Welcome to Western democracy.
Exactly. No. I know. The fact that they don't have any sort of sense of shame or self-awareness, it's just extraordinary. But that's what's happened. I mean, it really has. And that's new. People didn't say those kind of things when I was young or even 15 years ago.
Right. I mean, that's why I think that we're in a different time. And you are right. The deep state used to always come out and win and it got its way, but people are onto it now, and they're getting onto it more and more quickly. And we saw calls for the AfD to restore the energy pipeline. If they do that, and if they go through and they restore relations with Russia and this thing, the whole thing will break apart, right? I mean, it's just like, who's in charge now?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, because Germany is so important. Germany is the heart of the European Union. And so if Germany does flip, goes to a true dissident party, that's going to have monumental repercussions. But I think that's also, you saw the resistance to that, with the former commissioner saying that we are not going to let that happen. So that's what we're looking at. I think that's what we're seeing in Europe, and that's the future of Europe. It's a fight between, let's call them, what we call them, authoritarian Democrats.
Authoritarian democracy.
Against populist democracy.
Right. But they're framed as the authoritarian or the far right. The second coming of Hitler.
Right. The ones that are trying to come to power through the ballot box, right? Those are the people we have to stop, using extra constitutional means.
Yeah. Well, when is that election? I think that'll be a very interesting date.
I think it's February 23rd.
February 23rd.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I know that it's actually the Christian Democrats are favored, but apparently there's separate elections for party, I guess for representatives for the parties, and then for the chancellor, and the AfD woman is favored to win actually the chancellor election, to come in first, and then I think the AfD is expected to come in second in the general elections, and they should really have a share in the government, but that all these parties will work to keep them out. That's
right.
But there may be some point where they get past 50. I think they're around 30% now. The AfD but if they get, and they still have a ways to go, to get to 50%. And then it would be nice, of course, if like Sarah Wagenknecht's party could cooperate with them. I think at this point they still refuse to, but it seems to me that they have a lot in common. The most important things they actually agree on. That would increase the chances of a true dissident government.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think one thing we've learned is Polling is can't really be trusted that much. We've seen it here that I think a lot of times the association with far right, now everything's become far right, will often let people, even on anonymous polling, not want to admit that, for example, they support a candidate like Trump, and that's why we saw, against Hillary Clinton, Clinton was favored heavily to win, and they tried to make the polling here between Kamala and Trump very close when it clearly wasn't. So we'll see. I think that there's always a little under self-reporting if you are a supporter of the AfD, because people don't want to be associated with.
Right. I think we probably need to end it here. I think I hear your mother trying to get into the room. We're in,
all right.
in a hotel in a state park in Georgia. So anyway, we'll be back at our usual surroundings on Wednesday.
Okay, yeah, we'll go over. We'll leave it there. Okay, you and Mom have a good time. All right.
We'll talk to you later.
Okay, bye-bye.